My name is Lydia Graslie. I'm a threat detection engineer at Edward Jones, and today we're going to be talking about purple teaming in Azure, specifically Azure IAM. And also, we're going to have a bunch of silly pictures about snakes on a plane because snakes on a plane. All right, so about me, I'm a threat detection engineer at Edward Jones. I'm also now a TA for SANS Cloud Threat Detection in 541. I'm actually TAing this week. So if you're in 541, you'll be able to hang out with me and Ryan for a day on Saturday, and then I'm going back to DC. I'm a former English teacher. I'm a career changer. I went to China for a year. I taught English, got really into international relations, did a paper on cybersecurity policy, specifically Mandiant's AP21. I thought this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Said I wanted to do that. And I had no idea what I was doing. I'm from South Dakota. So I had never seen enterprise computing before because we have 5 people in South Dakota and 3 computers, and 2 of them are East River, and I'm from West River. So we had the one computer. I shouldn't say that because we do have a very good computer science program at School of Mines. That guys are awesome. But anyway, so I moved out to DC. I discovered I really didn't know computers. There was a lot more computers out there and computing concepts than I'd ever seen before. So I worked on a help desk with my master's degree because I really wanted to know what I was talking about. I worked my way up from being a level 1 help desk analyst to being an on-site sysadmin, got recruited to go work in cybersecurity, and the rest, as they say, is history. I never did get into cybersecurity policy. I stayed an engineer because, as it turns out, engineering is pretty rad. Love it, love being technical, love being hands-on, building things, breaking stuff, all about it. My spare time, I'm usually tinkering my home lab. I do comedy. I did a stand-up showcase at DC Improv last year. That was a ton of fun. I also love hockey. Very excited. Hockey season is starting. Sorry to all the Avalanche fans. I'm a Caps fan. And music. So what we're going to learn today, why Azure IAM is hard. What do we consider when we're purple teaming, and how do we stay organized? This is my research framework that I mentioned in the framework at the top of the outline. So, but first, a little bit of housekeeping. Why purple team? Why go through all this work? If we write all these detections and put them in place, do we need to go through all the additional work of purple teaming? And it's because this is hard. Cloud is hard. It's complex. It's not intuitive. It's easy to miss things. It's easy to miss settings. It's easy to miss log sources. It's not intuitive at all. And purple teaming for threat detection really makes sure that we're covered, ensures we have the logs we need and the events show up as we expect. Because if the events aren't in the format you expect, your detections aren't going to work. It helps us build the right detections for the resources environment that we have. Why would you write a bunch of SQL detections, for example, if you don't have a SQL server? Doesn't make any sense, right? You're building a bunch of resources or spending resources on things you don't have. It also enables robust detections that couple multiple attack paths or procedures of a technique, and it informs thorough and helpful documentation for responders. And this is really critical because if your responders don't understand your documentation, they don't know how to fix it, they don't know where to go, what use is the detection? Not much. So if you want to keep good relations with the responder team, write robust detections, purple teaming is super helpful. I highly recommend. The TLDR on purple teaming for threat detections is three phases. The first phase is you do a malicious thing. We have our pilot lady on the left here fighting a snake, right? That's our malicious thing. Step 1, we have to do it safely, so she has a helmet on. Second step is we record that malicious thing. We see we're still fighting the snake, but now we got some people with clipboards recording us fighting the snake on the ground. And then we look at the logs that are produced by fighting the snake or whatever malicious activity you're simulating in the sim. So Azure IAM. IAM 101, for a very quick overview, gives secure access to company resources like emails, databases, data, and applications to verified identities, and deal with the bare minimum of interference. The goal is to manage access so that the right people can do their jobs and the wrong people, like hackers, are denied entry. That's the Microsoft definition. It's a good definition. Since we're talking about Microsoft, we might as well use it. But Azure IAM is not necessarily intuitive. We see that we have at least 3 different layers here. Above everything you see at the very top, we have the Microsoft Entra roles. These are global roles. They manage everything in the tenant, but they also manage like other parts of like the M365, which is why they're included. This matters because what's a good way to explain why it matters? It matters, and I'll come up with a good explanation. Matters. Below that, you have what's called global administrator, user access administrator. This still included in the Entra role, but here's the trick: is that people think that global admin gives you access to do everything in the tenant, and that's true, but it's not by default. There are switches you have to enable, toggles you have to turn on in order to get access to all the resources. It doesn't just give you blanket access to everything right out of the gate. Then below that, we have Azure roles: owner, contributor, reader, user access administrator, management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. So right, there's a ton of different layers to IAM in Azure. This is an extremely quick and dirty overview. It's not at all comprehensive. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them later, but this is sort of like the 30-second TLDR. So why is it hard? Because not everything that you do in Azure around IAM is logged. Azure resources don't automatically export log all activity. Extra word in there. Log settings are everywhere. They are both at the resource level, at the Entra level, other places too. And you need to set up diagnostic settings to collect these logs. Otherwise, you're just not going to get information about them. So if we go back to the previous slide, you'll see like the resources here are down at the bottom, right? The Entra stuff is at the top. If I go on to the next slide, you'll see my diagnostic settings slide. But the logs in the portal don't necessarily equate to logs in your SIM. There's a lot of unanticipated things that can happen between the GUI and your SIM. So if I go back to what I was just referencing about diagnostic settings, you need to set up at least settings in at least 2 different places, levels in the tenant, right? Both at the Entra level to collect all the Entra logs, all the stuff around global admin activities, application head, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and also at the resource level. And this is not intuitive, right? Because you think like, I'm pushing buttons. Why don't I get events for all the things that I push buttons on? Because you see it set up diagnostic settings to collect these logs, to route them to where you want to go. It's not on by default. So what isn't logged by default? Key vault activities is a big one. You can't see who creates or deletes keys or secrets or who's looking at them unless you turn on a diagnostic settings for this. After you set up a Kubernetes cluster, for example, you cannot see important details like changing the authorized IP ranges. So as an example, if I set up a web app in a K8s cluster, and I have a list of authorized IP ranges once at setup, if I change that authorized IP, I'm not going to get a log event for it unless I specifically enable logging for that Kubernetes cluster. What does this mean? If I set up a web app, I've got a specific range of IPs that I want to allow access to it from. I change the authorized IPs, suddenly nobody can get to my web app. And you're not going to have an indication why unless you go in there and you start troubleshooting. You figure out eventually, oh, well, it's because a list of authorized IP changes. But how many hours is that going to take? A while. So making sure you have the logs is going to save you a lot of headache in the long run because you're going to be able to see what changed and when. Linux and event logs inside of VMs, also not logged by default. So like sys logs, Windows event logs, audit-d, not logged by default. You have to set up special logging in order to collect those events in Azure. They may be on the host in the VM, but they're not going to be in the Azure tenant unless you set up specifically. Another one that I thought was really interesting was creating new management groups or subscriptions. That's not logged by default. This creates a gap around Azure policy because Azure policy can be set up on the management group level as well as the subscription level. So if you create a new management group in your tenant, your Azure policy settings may not be applied to that management group, and you can sort of like bypass a lot of the security controls in it, which again, you won't know because you don't have a log. Azure Resource Manager Git list operations, you can enumerate ARM undetected unless you set up logging for it. So when I talked about logging, here's what I mean, and I probably should put the slide before the other one. When I say that something isn't logged by default, I mean that event isn't available in an exportable stream to a non-native storage or security tool. A lot of these events are available in the Azure GUI or in Sentinel or Defender, but you can't get them out of that portal, is what I mean here. But this is really impractical for threat response and a non-starter for threat detection engineers, right? Because if I have a non-Microsoft SIM and I can't get a log for the activity, like there's nothing I can do, right? I need to have a log stream that puts that event in my SIM, or else there's nothing I can do to write a detection on, because you can't write a detection on portal logs. Not yet, anyway. And getting logs out of Azure gets weird. It gets real weird. There's a variety of different ways you can do it through event hubs. Setting up event hubs is weird. It's easy to miss setting up a diagnostic setting. People do it all the time because every K8s cluster, for example, that's a resource. Azure Key Vault, that's a resource. And you don't, unless you have Azure policy set up to enforce this, it's not easy to see like what you have logging set up on and what you don't. Azure policy can help mitigate this, which I learned in SEC 541. You will too, take the class. Your SIM might also alter the events through normalization. Splunk does this. Elastic does this. A lot of people write their own normalization to make grouping events easier, and that's great, but it also is a little bit lossy because you lose the context of the original event unless you can collect that event as a record. And then some events just never make it to your SIM by design, like the directory activity logs. This is a wild ride. So earlier this year, I was doing research on user access admin, which is the little circled thing I showed you earlier. So global admin does not control all activity in Azure by default. Like you can't do stuff with global admin by default. You need to do what's called an elevation to user access administrator, which is the most generic, like benign name you can think of, but it's actually code for root level access in Azure, which you'd think should be logged, and it is logged. But if you try to get that log out, you're going to run into some interesting conundrums because it shows up in two sources: the Azure activity logs in the directory logs, which is through the CLI or the Azure Monitor only, and in the Entra logs, but it's in preview. It's not recommended for prod. They said, like, don't rely on it. Okay. So what does this mean? So we have two log sources and we're looking at user access administrator elevation. Only one of them can send that event to an outside SIM, right? Without programmatically using the AZ CLI, that's not recommended. Using PowerShell to collect this and send to a SIM, it's not a good use case. You need to use other APIs. So, and like I said, the elevation event in the audit logs is a preview. It does not have an SLA. It is not intended for prod environments. So if we're using PIM, for example, and somebody is elevating to global admin, you don't necessarily know reliably if they are elevating to user access administrator according to this event. So, but this is really good to know, right? So, because you need to know when people have root level access to Azure, like that's an important thing. So, but if you're writing a detection on this, you may not know that, right? You may not know that this event in the directory activity logs is not going to show up in your SIM, right? Because you see in the portal, you think, oh, well, it's in the portal, it's Azure activity logs. Azure activity logs go to my SIM, not the directory logs. They do not. You think, oh, it's in the audit logs. That goes to my SIM. Maybe. Maybe it goes to your SIM. Don't bet on it in prod. So the takeaway here is to always check and make sure it goes to your SIM and that there's no little quirks around the events that might throw off your responders. Other reasons an event may look different in your SIM: normalization. As I mentioned earlier, Splunk does normalization, Elastic does normalization. Case changes. This is really big in Azure activity logs because in the operation name in Azure activity logs in the portal is very frequently all uppercase. So it's like Microsoft authorization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in a lot of SIMs, like these events will be in lowercase. But why does this matter? Because detections logic is frequently case sensitive unless you explicitly make it so. So if you're writing detection logic that is all in uppercase and your event comes across and it's in lowercase, is your detection going to detect on that? Nope. Not unless you know about it ahead of time. Ryan Thompson told me about this. So you might also be collecting from a different table than you expected. This happens between like the Azure audit logs and the Office Management API. So sometimes you can get duplicate events or events that are very similar, but one will come from the Management API and one will come from the Azure audit logs. They look a little bit different. So you've got to make sure that the event you're expecting shows up there. It's from the table you collected so that you can write an accurate detection. What to consider? Where was the button you pushed? How did you trigger that button? Was it through PowerShell? Was it through the GUI? And then I have a little update on licensing. So there's frequently multiple or very subtly different ways to perform an action in Microsoft Cloud that generate different events or sequences of events depending on where the action is done. One example is creating a new unlicensed user. There's at least 3 different places you can do this. There's the Azure Entra ID portal, the Microsoft Entra ID admin portal, Exchange PowerShell, and I'm pretty sure you can do this in Graph. Why does this matter? Because they all generate different logs, slightly different, but close enough that you're not going to catch it until you run into problems down the line. Ask me how I know. I ran into problems down the line. Is how I know. So in the Entra admin event sequence, when you add a new user, a new unlicensed user, it's add user followed by add member to group, right? Cool. Nothing earth-shattering there. Add member to group is automatic, not prompted by you. Happens automatically. In the Azure ID portal, the event sequence goes add user, cool. Add service principal, add service principal. Then add member to group. I'm like, okay, well, it's Azure. Azure uses service principals. I don't know why I don't have one when I do it in the Microsoft Entra ID portal, but okay, yeah, fine. Then we go to Exchange PowerShell. Exchange PowerShell is new user, but it doesn't tell you who it was created by. It says initiated by, which is the user who does the action. Microsoft Substrate Management, not the actual user. And then add member to group. No add service principal, but initiated by Microsoft Substrate Management. So what does this mean? So there's at least 3 different places you can create a new user in Microsoft Cloud, 365 in Azure. The Azure Entra ID method automatically generates the event for a service principal. The other 2 do not. Exchange PowerShell method obscures who created the new user. In the initiated by field, as I mentioned earlier, this Microsoft Substrate Management, which is an automated process, is the one who created the new user in that example. And this is confusing for defenders, right? Because all of a sudden, if somebody, or you're doing an exercise, or somebody's creating a new user in your tenant, you see in the initiated by field, is Microsoft Substrate Management creating a new user in my tenant? Like, why is Microsoft creating a new user in my tenant? The API call is coming from inside the house. Like that could easily like distract defenders, like you're gonna spend minutes, maybe hours, like chasing down, why is Microsoft creating a new user? Unless you know this quirk that, no, this is just an Exchange PowerShell quirk, it's actually somebody else. Maybe it's a real user, maybe it's not, maybe it's something, another application. But again, confusion that leads to slowing down to responders that leads to inefficient detections. So how you where you perform an action matters, you need to write it down. Licensing and log levels. So there's a big hullabaloo about E5 and E3 licensing. You've probably heard about it. People are doing license downgrade attacks from E5 to E3. Microsoft has promised to fix this, and they said we were going to roll out log events that are available to everybody. It was completed in 2024. There still are logging differences between audit standard and premium. I'm not sure exactly now what they are. So that's another research topic for me, but there are still events. A lot of it has changed around the default retention has changed. And some other insights I think I know is now part of audit premium and not standard. It also affects access to the management API, but you still need premium P1 or P2 licensing for all users whose events are being logged to export them to an outside SIEM. So if you're expecting to generate activity on certain users, but you don't have this license enabled, like the logs aren't going to go. They're just going to be stuck. So make sure everybody's properly licensed and you have reliable events. Staying organized. This is by far the hardest part of purple teaming because it's really, really easy to get lost. I do it all the time. I've been doing this now for 6 years. There are many ways to stay organized, lots and lots of fancy tools. I'm a nerd. I love Excel. I use spreadsheets. Write down what you did, when you did it, and how you did it. And you also need to keep copies of all the logs you generated with your testing. So the basics, and this really can apply to any sort of purple teaming, is where you performed an action. So what page did you perform the operation on? What buttons did you press if you're using the GUI? How you performed an action? Is it through the AZ CLI? Is it through PowerShell? What kind? There's different kinds of PowerShell. Is it through the GUI? And when you performed an action. So not all events and logs will be directly triggered by you. We talked about in the new user example, I just mentioned, like, that add member to group, you didn't do that. Tenant did that, did it for you. So it's really helpful to know what you do directly and what is sort of like an automatic activity that's generated by the tenant. Timestamps also help you build a very clearer picture of the outcome, and as well as the command or the input that you did. So what command specifically did you run? What buttons specifically did you push? Do you want to include usernames, group names, IP ranges? So any sort of like custom input that you're putting in there, write that down. Azure specific things you need to record. If you're testing a resource, include the subscription ID. The subscription is where that Azure resource lives. Just because you say, okay, well, we've got logs coming in from all these Azure resources, we're good, right? Not necessarily, because your tenant probably has multiple subscriptions. Logs could be set up differently depending on the subscription. Maybe it goes to one table. Maybe one subscription is set up properly, but another one's not. It's important to include where the event showed up. So did it show up in the activity logs? Did it show up the audit logs? Did it show up in another source? Did it make it to your log analytics workspace? And if so, which one? Because you can have more than one. Did they make it to your SIM? Did the events change? The IDs of the events generated for an action. So I really like including the IDs of an event because it's sort of like a static identifier that's really helpful when you're searching across like a really big database. Helps you go right to that event, pick it up right away. In the activity and audit logs, this is a correlation ID. This is actually sort of an ID that shows like events for a particular stream of activity that's happening. And just but in the sign-in logs, it's just ID. Very simple. And so here's my example sheet. You see we have the time, the action, the method, the URL, logged, where it's logged, then make it to your SIM. What's the correlation ID? And then your notes. So if we're going back to our previous example about the new user, we see like here's sort of an example sheet I created for that new user activity testing. The first one is through the Exchange PowerShell. That's my method that I write up there. URL, no URL, PowerShell. Was it logged? Yes, it made it to the audit logs, my default log analytics workspace. Did it make it to the SIM? Yes. Here's the correlation ID for the activity. Notes. I note any weirdness that might throw off my defenders later. So again, this is not earth-shattering rocket scientists. Like I don't get to show you cool tools like John Ziola does, but this is sort of like things that I wish that I would have known when I started out purple teaming and didn't realize until people were like, what does this mean? What's happening here? And then you go back and you realize, oh, well, that's not what I expected. So here's all the key ways to keep things you don't expect. Second column, basically same as the user. So say I created a new user, it's Azure user at domain.com through the GUI. Didn't include the buttons here because it wouldn't fit on a PowerPoint slide, but y'all are smart people. Cyber, you figure it out. The URL of where I push this, you see like, again, between the M365 user and the Azure AD user on the next line, different URLs. Saves you some time having to go back and figure out like, where did I go to push this button? That's where you went. Right logs. Yeah, again, made it to the audit logs, made it to the default log analytics workspace. Yes, I made it to the SIM. Here's a correlation ID. No notes here. Third line, same as the first. And that's what I got. So, left some time for questions. Please connect with me and be my friend on LinkedIn. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to send me an email or catch me in the hallway.